Hello and welcome to the Take Charge podcast. Our guest for this episode is Charlotte Flanagan, who joined Group14 Technologies last year as the Director of Diversity and Belonging and recently broadened her role to also cover sustainability. Diversity, equity, and inclusion is a topic I'm very passionate about. I released an article on the subject in May last year, and I've been waiting for the right guest to join me on the podcast to delve deeper into the topics. Charlotte has over 10 years of experience focusing on DEI with the likes of Alaska Airlines, SAP, and DocuSign prior to joining Group14. In this episode, we discuss plenty of DEI topics, providing an array of tips for our listeners and share some success and horror stories from years gone by. I'm a huge admirer of all the great work Charlotte is doing in this area, and it was a great honor to welcome her to the show. Charlotte, thank you for taking charge. Hi, Charlotte. Welcome to the show. Thank you for coming on.
Oh, thanks so much for having me, Jamie. Appreciate it.
No, it's really keen to discuss diversity, equity, and inclusion. I did an article in the middle of last year, around May last year, and I was always keen to do a follow-on podcast. So I'm really glad to have you on as a real specialist in the space and impart some of your knowledge for our audience. So to begin with, let's start with your background. What inspired you to pursue a career around diversity, equity, and inclusion?
Yeah. I actually like to say that I was accidentally stumbled upon this work several years ago. I've been doing DEI for probably 15 years on and off in different capacities. But when I first actually paid gig, so to speak, in leading diversity and inclusion, I was actually tapped by a leader to do that at Alaska Airlines a long time ago. And when I asked why me, for a variety of reasons. One being I didn't have necessarily a professional background in the space, and she told me that I get things done. And so I thought that was enough of a reason for me to kind of explore the opportunity, and really honestly a chance to learn a lot of new things in a space that was evolving very quickly at the time, and really moving from kind of like a compliance focus in the US really to kind of something that could span across the employee experience, and really impact the employee experience all the way from hiring through to promotions to training and development. And so it piqued my curiosity, and so I said yeah.
Great. And then how long were you with Alaskan Airlines? You were there for quite some time.
Yeah, I was with Alaska for over 10 years. So that's really kind of where I started my career, grew up there, and did a variety of roles from employee engagement and experience through leadership training and development, did some employer branding work there as well. And then my last role there was leading diversity and inclusion.
Great. And you recently joined Group14. So talk us through your role and focus with them.
Yeah. Yeah, I joined Group14 about 5, 6 months ago, and I was brought on to lead our diversity and inclusion efforts, which is rare for a small company our size to have someone that's doing that. And that's one of the biggest reasons I loved the role, was because they were investing in it so early. My role shifted recently to take on sustainability as well, kind of across the ESG landscape, so to speak. And so I'm leading a lot of work, not just on DEI, but also on kind of our sustainability strategy as a business, and then also on some of our community outreach and engagement efforts, making sure that as we expand, we're really doing so with our communities in mind.
I've seen that more often, the connection between DEI and ESG, sustainability and GSD, sometimes being paired within one role or within a particular focus. So uh, could you speak to us a little bit more about that connection and why those are paired together?
Yeah, yeah. Well, so ESG stands for environmental, social, and governance. And so if you think about all three areas of the work, there's obviously, I think the E gets a lot of attention, but on the S side, on the social side, that's where diversity and inclusion, and what was historically called corporate social responsibility really fits in. But diversity also fits in on the governance side as well. How does a company operate? What is the board? How is the board of directors set up? What's the diversity of the board of directors? There's a lot of different elements of diversity and inclusion that go across the E, the S, and the G. And so you're right, I'm seeing a lot more kind of diversity and inclusion roles actually either leading all of ESG, or kind of being paired with the sustainability team, because there's so much connection across all three areas that it really does make sense.
Didn't think about it that way, but yeah, the CSR, corporate social responsibility, and into ESG, very good. So to kick us off, how would you simply define diversity, equity, and inclusion?
Yeah. Um, I think they're obviously three very different things to me that get lumped um, into this like three-letter terminology that gets thrown around a lot, right? Diversity is honestly like the makeup of your organization, but I would say at the team level. Um, uh, so how many different experiences do you have across your team, different knowledge, skills, and abilities, different backgrounds, different experiences. Inclusion to me is more about, and equity, I would say, is more about the experience and kind of the culture within the organization. That includes things like benefits, policies, norms, values of the organization. How do your employees experience the workplace, and how can they really be successful and set up for success in their individual roles and connected to the overall success of the business? And you do that through a number of different ways, in the employee experience, whether it's your hiring processes, pay equity can go into that, performance reviews, how your values come to life across the organization. Um, and then equity, um, is a big part of that, because I think it has to do with how are you setting up, the vast diversity that you're hopefully bringing into your organization. How are you setting up those individuals for success, and really making sure that they have access to the needs and the benefits and things that they need to be successful, because not all of us are going to be successful with the same exact tools. And so I think equity is a really huge part of that. And it goes into, I would say, community outreach and engagement as well, the equity portion of that, and making sure that as you go into a community or you're doing outreach within a community, how are you engaging some of the specific communities that have historically been left behind, and how can you remove some roadblocks for them to ensure they have equal access to the roles that you're bringing into communities and things like that.
Mm. You mentioned a lot of really good points there. Just to delve deeper on a couple of them, you mentioned team level, so diversity at team level. Would you say it's more important for an organization to focus on their overall company diversity? So if someone's to be quite figure focused or number focused, which I don't necessarily think is the answer, or would you recommend a company look at it more from a team level to make sure that each organization, each team, mini organization within the business is diverse?
Yeah. No, I think it's really important to get as granular as you can, with diversity, from a team level. And I think that's important because really depending on the size of your organization, if you're just looking at the overall demographics, they can vary drastically from team to team. And so my suggestion is always, for the larger organizations, if you have teams of, 100 of people, if you can take that data and really kind of get a good sense of what does the diversity on your team look like, that's really impactful. And that's something that I did, during my time at DocuSign. Actually, we looked at team by team information, and the demographics were incredibly different. Representation looked very different across teams. And that was powerful information for the leaders to be able to really take action on the things that they owned across their organization, because data is incredibly powerful. Obviously, it varies in terms of what you can, look at and what you can collect globally. But I think it's important to look at it, as granular as you can,
Because I guess
when
it
you
could be
can.
quite misleading. Maybe with an organization, HR, maybe marketing is more female led, and then in
Yeah,
let's say sales and engineering, it's more male heavy. Not always the case, but an overall number might look pretty good. But then actually, it's like,
yeah,
well, a lot of your teams that are actually working together. That's the key thing here. So, which teams are actually working together? Are they diverse? Because that's where the innovation comes from, the difference
yeah,
in perspective to actually drive that team to become more successful. Um,
yeah.
so some good points. obviously through your work, I guess this would be a bit of a biased answer, and I would agree with it. But how important is DEI when it comes to the overall success of a business?
Yeah. I think it's kind of it's definitely a must-have. I think right now, I think the way you get to diversity, equity, and inclusion is different for each team and each organization, and it needs to be an authentic approach. Um, and that's where I think some companies get a little tripped up by it. But I think there's been numerous studies out there that show that diverse teams are more innovative, they're more effective, there's higher employee engagement. But I also think that the focus on diversity needs to come after the focus on inclusion. So you need to kind of quote unquote get your own house in order and really make sure you have a strong, accepting, and inclusive culture really before you start focusing on the diversity aspect of it. So really kind of making sure that your culture is welcome, that people can come in and they can be successful, that they have access to the tools that they need to be successful, that you've got great policies in place, benefits in place that help everyone succeed. And I think that kind of stuff really helps set you up for success, um, more so than kind of trying to get as much diverse teams, gathering as diverse teams as possible first, and then they come in and they're not really set up for success to thrive.
That's a really good point. Inclusion first, and then maybe look at your diversity focus. Um, I've seen something similar in the past where an organization has tried to hire diverse people who are kind of outside of their current demographic, brought them into the business, and because it's non-inclusive, those individuals have left very quickly,
Yeah,
and ultimately experience a bad account of that organization. So it makes it even harder for them to recruit more diverse people.
right.
So no, I think that's really really important. And as you say, a diverse group isn't able to work effectively if there isn't inclusion, if they don't feel included, because they kind of have the opposite effect. Um, so no, thank you for that. Um, in terms of equity as well, so this is, I guess, sometimes a new term, and some individuals get it confused with equality. So
Hmm.
equality versus equity. So let's talk a bit about that. I guess it'd be good to define what equity is and then what equality is from an
Yeah,
employment perspective.
sure. I mean, equality is kind of treating everyone the same, so to speak, and making sure that you're giving everyone the same thing. Equity really takes into consideration, um, in my opinion, making sure people have the tools that they need to be successful. There's a great image, a variety of versions of the images where my favorite one is actually giving everyone the exact same size bicycle, and expecting that no matter what you have, you'll be able to ride that bicycle. Um, there's another image right next to it that's it shows a recumbent bicycle should someone have to use their arms to pedal. It's got a smaller bicycle for someone maybe like a child. It's got a variety of types of bicycles, and I think that really displays this concept of equity in a really compelling way, because it shows that not everyone, all of us are diverse just by being individuals, and we all have our different needs and things that we need to be successful. And so I think that really gets to the heart of what equity is making sure that people have the tools that they need to succeed, and not giving everyone the exact same tools and expecting them to succeed.
Hmm. There's yeah, it's a really good one. The bicycle example. There's another one with a fence as well. So the fence and the
Hmm.
boxes, the
Yep.
same size box, and there's someone short, someone kind of medium height, someone tall, and they're trying to see over the fence to watch the game going on.
Yep.
So yeah,
Yep.
really good illustration. Um, Very good. And you've obviously moved into the energy storage space recently in the last kind of 5 or 6 months. Um, how do you see the landscape compared to other industries that you've worked in from a demographic point of view?
Yeah. I see similar challenges, so far. One of the thing that's really interesting, and I'd love to actually get your perspective on this, being new to this industry and having come from the tech industry, is there's a lot of research that's been done on the technology industry specifically in terms of diversity, equity, inclusion. When I left Alaska Airlines, I went into the technology industry because of that. There was so much disruption and conversation around DEI, and that I think really led to a lot of um, technology specific, tech industry specific research, and a lot of demographic sharing, a lot of networking groups and things like that were coming together really to try to help solve DEI and to be able to kind of partner and work together. I haven't seen a lot of that in the battery and space, and so I'm actually curious if they do exist, and I'm just not haven't been introduced to the right people yet, and expanding my network. Um, but I'd love for more research to be done in this space, and to have leaders come together and actually be talking about some of these issues. I think there's obviously the same issues are going to apply kind of wherever you go from an industry standpoint. Our societal norms, the biases that can creep into a lot of the different processes and stages of employee experience. Um, Things like that, I think, will exist in all industries. But I haven't seen a ton of research on the battery space on DEI specifically. So that's what I'm actually kind of digging into more right now, and would love to learn from others in this space as well, and see what's out there.
Yeah, definitely. I'd advise looking at the Volta Foundation. They have what they
Yep.
call Jedi's. So not as in Star Wars Jedi's, but justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion project directors who are dedicated to this sort of thing and have a lot of experience. And in terms of research, I'm pretty sure they have run quite a lot of research and have some good reports.
Yeah.
But because the industry is still new, fairly new in terms of industry terms, um, just hasn't been approached as much as other organizations or other
Mm.
industries. So yeah,
Yeah.
there's definitely more work to be done on that. In terms of where I see the splits or where we're kind of falling down the most from a nationality perspective, I'd say very diverse. There's a lot of international candidates in the
Yeah.
US from Korea and China, bringing a lot of different perspective and obviously experience from that part of the world, which is leading the way. For a male female divide and other categories associated to that, that's where there's the biggest imbalance. So we
Yeah.
have some work to do there to identify, well, create a pathway for women in different categories who can get into the battery field, STEM
Mhm.
programs and things. And there's some great work that Barbara Hughes is doing with She's in Power,
Okay.
Colorado-based non-for-profit, which focuses on mentoring women and helping them get into the sector. So I think
Oh, cool.
we need more role models. It kind of starts somewhere. You need role models to kind of lead the charge, and things then start to change over time. But it doesn't happen overnight. It takes some inspiring
Yeah.
people to inspire these changes. Um, in terms of improvements over the years, I know you've been doing this for some time. What rate of
Mhm.
improvement have you seen since establishing your career in diversity, equity, and inclusion? And are we improving fast enough, in your opinion?
Yeah. I certainly think awareness, from an improvement standpoint, has drastically increased, just in this space, what it is. That said, I think that people are still have a long way to go. I don't think we've reached kind of the place where we need to be from that standpoint. And I think that people that have been doing this work and been very aware of it for a long time, I kind of like to think of it about like a marathon, right? There's people who are just starting at the start line, and just kind of getting comfortable with even just talking about diversity, equity, inclusion issues. There's people who have been, running this marathon for years and years and years, and are way ahead of a lot of us. And I think that um, there's some fatigue in that space, and some frustration. I also think that there is a lot of misunderstanding about what diversity, equity, and inclusion work really is. And unfortunately, some of the areas that are getting the most attention is a lot of some of the stuff that is just not necessarily what diversity and inclusion is all about, um, and that's unfortunate. But I do think we've made a lot of way. I think that there's great technology that's supporting diversity, equity, and inclusion work. Um, there's so much information out there, way more than there was before. There's incredible networks. Just the head of diversity role is very, very new. But one thing I love about this area is that it's everyone is so open and welcoming, and we're like very open to have a conversation and to talk about what works and what doesn't work, and to have really great dialogue, to share resources and to collaborate and come together. Um, and I do think from a leadership standpoint, a lot more leaders are understanding the value of this work, and supporting bringing on, chief diversity officers, or head of ESG, or chief sustainability officers, and having the work come in under that area. Um, and that's fantastic. And so I do think that the support of the work is great. But I think more work absolutely needs to be done on what this work is, and why it exists, and really connect it back to the strategy of the company, and focus on that, and less so on maybe activities that are being done and things like that, and really showcase kind of what is this work. Um, how does it help companies get to, you know, more success?
Hmm. You mentioned at the beginning of the conversation that you admired how Group14 have brought you in and established this position, being still relatively small. When do you think an organization should appoint this sort of position? Should it be one of the founding members? If it's not one of the founding members with that dedicated title, should there be someone at least dedicated to having that as part of the responsibilities? When should an organization start really thinking about this?
Yeah, I think when you're at probably a certain threshold of say 50 employees, right? You're starting to craft a culture within your organization. And I think at that point, you may not, have the funds to necessarily bring on someone full time in this work. Um, but you should absolutely be thinking about, all right, our culture is being created right now. How do we make sure that we're creating this company in a way that is going to scale, and that's going to, you know, be true to who we are. So thinking about when you're creating your values as an organization, really making sure that you're bringing either from a consulting standpoint, or someone on your people team or within your organization that has this experience, that can really help think through diversity, equity, and inclusion aspects as you're building those kinds of programs and things out that are probably going to last years and years before you kind of sit down and think about, all right, do we need to revisit our values as we've grown? Um, but I do think, I mean, Group14 is growing at an incredible pace. And so I think it was very smart. They saw that, and it was very smart of them to kind of think about, all right, we need to be thinking about, as we grow, how do we grow inclusively? Um, and so it really does depend on the business. If you're going to be, growing a little bit slower, you can probably approach this work in a little bit of a different way. But I think the earlier you can think about inclusion, you don't necessarily need a full-time chief diversity officer as part of like the founding, five or whatever. But I think having kind of that experience, and if you don't have that experience internally, kind of trying to seek it out, to help you along the way, is super important.
Hmm. Yeah, I agree. I think maybe if when you get to 50 people, looking at whether bringing in a specialist or having someone really dedicated to that, to then identify how you scale, put a strategy together.
Mhm.
But I agree as well with the second point of get this done as soon as possible, because you don't want to get to a company of 50 people with a really non-inclusive culture, with a really
Yeah,
non-diverse group of people, because then, as you said before, if you then want to identify diverse people, they're not going to want to join because they don't identify with anyone else in the business, because it's not very diverse and it's not very inclusive. So
yeah,
yeah, I really think business leaders and founders and entrepreneurs should have this as a key part of their strategy, because if they get it right at the beginning, it's going to be
yeah,
much easier for them to get to 200 people, um,
yeah,
if they've got the first 10, 15, 20 people right.
Yeah.
So
Yeah,
that's, I think it's
exactly.
becoming more and more important over time. Um, so just kind of following on with this point, what advice would you give to a team that's about to embark on their DEI journey? They're just about to think about this quite seriously.
Yeah. I think spending a lot of time on that discovery phase is super important, and I think that's where some companies are so eager to kind of jump in and start to do things that they don't necessarily um, do a lot of discovery to begin with. So again, kind of depending on where you are in terms of like your business maturity and how many employees you have and things like that, I would really encourage people starting on this journey to think about the data, what data do you have access to, have a lot of conversations, do a lot more listening than you do talking. In the beginning, get out there and go have conversations with your mid-level managers across the business, have conversations with your entry-level employees, your frontline employees, your workforce that's coming in day to day and uh, doing the work that's going to make your company succeed. Have conversations with members of your board, your investors, your customers, really thinking about this work from a variety of stakeholders, not just within the company, but also outside of the company as well. If your customers absolutely are probably going to have a big point of view on this. Um, and then I think really defining kind of your overarching DEI roadmap that works for your company. I think there's certain elements that people say, all right, we have to do X, Y, and Z because when you look at diversity initiatives, everybody's doing X, Y, and Z. But I think really having that roadmap built upon kind of that listening tour and that discovery part of starting there will really help set you up for more success in terms of making your strategy more authentic to you and more connected to your business and your success. Because I think the worst thing you can do again is doing something because everyone else is doing it. Um, but but my biggest piece of advice is focus on what you need to do and not what others are doing. And then as we talked about, obviously the earlier you can put this work into practice, the better. Um, and then lastly, I'd say, don't just think about the short term goals. I think really having kind of short and long term goals are super important. So understanding the current landscape, kind of making sure you're getting buy-in and feedback from the leadership and your stakeholders, and then really being realistic about your roadmap and focusing on things that you think you can impact.
Nice. And before we get into the success stories of maybe some of the things that you've experienced over the years, let's talk about some horror stories. Some, some of the biggest mistakes you've seen when running campaigns like this.
Yeah. Um, Gosh, so I think some of the biggest mistakes that I have seen is kind of one, companies not necessarily including individuals from the communities that you either see are underrepresented within your own group or that you're trying to impact, whether it's through community outreach programs. And there's a concept that I learned, I think it came um, through a disability inclusion conference that I attended years ago. And there was this quote someone shared it says, "Nothing about us without us." And I think that that's really important to think through as you're building your strategies in supporting a variety of communities, is you have to make sure those communities are involved and engaged in the work that you're doing uh, to really ensure that you're not just putting something together because of your own assumptions or you feel like you know what that community needs. It's super important whether it's creating a product that's directed at that community, whether it's a internal program or an employee resource group, but you really do need to make sure that you're involving the community that you're trying to impact in a positive way or support. Um, the other kind of, I wouldn't necessarily say they're horror stories, but I'd say like lessons learned that I've observed. Um, Number one is transparency will breed trust. So there is data. There's a lot of different ways you can share and slice data. But I think at its core, you really do need to make sure that the data that you're showing is truthful and that you're not kind of manipulating it in a certain way to tell a certain story. And I think you see that a lot in sustainability reports, right? There's very selective ways that companies are sharing their information externally. Um, and I think that you can make data sound great if you are using a lot of different terminologies. Uh, but I think it's really important to kind of talk about, talk about the data in a very clear language, and then also talk about, where did you get it wrong, and where do you still feel like you need to work. Um, and then I think another lesson learned, and I've already talked about this a little bit, is really being authentic to what you can do and what your approach is in this space. You talked about Jedi and the term justice. Justice is righting a wrong. That's a big word. And I don't think that's a word that should be thrown around by any company, because not every single company can really impact that. I think if you actually have a product that you or an organization, or a vision where you feel like you can right a wrong and you can help with justice, then I think that that's an appropriate place to be using that term. But I do think you need to be authentic and really thoughtful about the terminology you're using, and the things you're supporting, and really making sure that you feel like, as an organization, you can impact that space. Because communication has to be authentic, and I think people can kind of see through it when it's not.
Yeah. Authenticity, I think has to be up there as number one. And to lead on to my next point, I was going to talk about positive discrimination, and might be a new term for some people. Some individuals might have been subject to it. So again, to talk about not necessarily a horror story, but examples of things that I've seen in the past. A business was very male heavy, and they wanted to, and that was because of the founding members. The founding members were all male. They all came to the same decision very quickly. That's good. They all agree on things. They share the same perspective. Obviously, if they had some different perspective in there, they'd innovate and they'd make the ideas better and things. But it is what it is. Wanted to hire more females to create more of a balance, and ultimately, when individuals started to join, they didn't feel included. But when going through that process, they didn't realize positive discrimination was present. So they had two candidates. One was male, one was female. They would go for the female because they were trying to hit a quota. And I've been asked to do this by certain clients. I was asked to do this when I was only maybe a year, 18 months into my career. And, I just didn't feel confident enough to, say no and say, this is the wrong thing to do, or to educate on it. I just didn't know enough about the subject. So I guess worth business owners, worth leaders keeping in mind that, of course, equity is one thing. Equity is different to positive discrimination, totally different.
Yeah.
But you've got to be really careful with these things, because, it's not about hitting a quota. It's about getting the right person in there for the job. In terms of your pipeline coming in, are you engaging with your community, as you just mentioned? Are
Yeah.
you exposing yourself to demographics, to organizations where you want to get yourselves in front of? I think that's the better thing to do in this sort of situation, and make sure that you have a set list of questions in your interview process, a real set list of criteria to help you make informed decisions, rather than then your unconscious bias
Yeah.
coming in and selecting the person that your gut feel thinks is the right person for the job.
Yeah.
So really powerful things on positive discrimination. What's your stance on it, and have you ever experienced anything similar to that?
Yeah. Well, I mean, in the hiring space, like that, what you kind of described is essentially illegal in the in
Yeah,
the in the U.S., right? You can't use demographics as a determining factor in hiring. And so, from my perspective, it's more about understanding your processes. And so, like what you just described in terms of an inclusive hiring process, really having a structured process, understanding where your talent pipeline is coming from, and perhaps that's limiting, who is coming, who's applying for the organization. Um, and so I think things like that are really important to be able to understand, where can we go, where are we marketing our roles, and where can we go um, to ensure that our opportunities are getting in front of a diverse pool of candidates, whatever that diversity looks like for your organization. And so I think really focusing on the process, understanding your limitations and how people have been hired in the past and how they've kind of come into your organization is really important, because that can be really eye-opening if you've got, a lot of people that are being hired from your own kind of network. That's going to be a limiting factor for you.
Mm.
And so I think focusing on process, talent pool, partnerships with organizations, and basically marketing and who you're marketing your roles to can really help with some of that to begin with.
Mm.
But yeah, positive discrimination was a new term for me, and I think it's one that you have to be extremely careful about because, as I mentioned, it's illegal in the U.S. Quotas are illegal in the U.S. You can't take that factor into a decision
Mm.
in the hiring process
Yeah.
here, and so you really need to focus on how do you diversify your candidate pool, and then also how do you make sure that your process is fair and equitable.
Yeah. That, and this came from an organization that was DEI conscious. They were making an effort to hire more diversely, and it was going too far. It was, I guess, that lack of education on
Yeah,
how they should really be approaching this. So yeah, look at your
yeah,
candidate pool, look at where you're advertising, look at the way you're writing your adverts.
yep,
Subconsciously, does it appeal more to men or women?
yep,
If you put more
absolutely,
criteria, in a job description or an advert, you will defer women from applying.
yeah,
The stats are always conflicting, but it's always in the same order. A man or a male will apply for a role if they match, say, 60% of the criteria, and
yeah,
a female applicant will only apply if they meet it by, say, 60% of the, sorry, 80% of the criteria.
80 or 90, yeah,
So they're ruling themselves out.
yep,
And a great piece of advice my auntie gave me, actually, because she works in HR for a large organization in Australia, big focus on disability, and
okay,
she said, let the business do the rejecting. Don't reject yourself before you've even applied. Apply for the
100%,
position, and let them do the rejecting. Um,
yeah,
so
yeah,
so yeah, I think it's good. It's
a lot.
it's important to educate everyone, not just organizations.
Yes, and that was going to be something else that I think is really important that a lot of companies don't do is they don't necessarily train hiring managers and individuals that are part of the process. And that's something that's incredibly important to start with is you have to make sure that the people that are doing the hiring outside of your recruitment team, so if they're on your interview panel, if they're the hiring manager, that they really understand kind of the expectations of the organization, that they understand the local laws that go along with it. And that's something that we did at Group14. It was one of the first things that we did, that I did when I got here, is we really made sure that we had a strong hiring training for anyone that was involved in interviewing, that hiring managers understood kind of they needed to make sure that they had a robust process in terms of identifying kind of who they wanted to focus on, what knowledge, skills, and abilities, that people were preparing their questions in advance and asking the candidates the same questions. Things like that really do matter. And one of my favorite, pieces of technology related to DEI is a company called Textio, because they started with a
Yeah.
lot of what you just talked about in terms of job descriptions and really making sure that they're inclusive. And they've actually moved into other areas of the employee experience now too. But it is pretty eye-opening in terms of kind of what kind of uh, uh, things can get in the way of candidates applying, and how do you remove those roadblocks as an organization to ensure you're getting the most diverse candidate pool possible.
Mm. Yeah, great reference, Textio. I'll put them as a reference for this podcast because, yeah, lots of really good data on what wording to use. So if any organization is looking to revise their adverts and their job descriptions to be more gender neutral, then
Mhm.
they've got some really good data and information on that.
Yeah,
So yeah, thank you
yeah.
for bringing that up. Um, let's talk about some success stories. So over the years, what success stories have you seen around these sorts of campaigns and incentives?
Yeah. I think in terms of success stories, I think some of the things that I have seen work really well is taking an approach in this work from how do you, I used to use the word infuse, like how do you infuse inclusion into the employee experience? So a lot of times companies will kind of create DEI programs that are kind of off to the side, um, that are not less important by any means. Um, but my philosophy has always been how do you create inclusive leadership training and development programs? If you're creating key, you know, key principles of what you expect from your people managers, for example, how do you build um, uh, inclusive aspects into that in terms of what you're expecting from your leadership? How do you build, like we just talked about, an inclusive hiring process? If you're creating a performance management program, how are you building inclusion into that performance management program? Um, versus kind of creating DEI training as an offshoot. How are you building DEI training into some of the programs that you're expecting all of your employees to go through or all of your leaders to go through? So for me, kind of threading it through or infusing it, or kind of however you want to say it, into your culture and into your employee experience is, in my opinion, one of the most effective ways to kind of bring this work to life. I always use the example of like diversity councils, and I always thought it was interesting that we needed diversity councils, because in my opinion, diversity, equity, inclusion should actually be another aspect of just your rhythm of the business topics. You know, when you're reviewing whatever other business metrics you're reviewing, diversity and inclusion should be part of that. It should be part of those quarterly business reviews and things like that, versus kind of this separate council that stood up um, uh, to kind of take things over. Now, I think if you have both and you need that council to kind of get some work done, that's fantastic. But I don't think that that should be the only opportunity where you're talking about diversity, equity, inclusion strategy and metrics and things like that. You should really be weaving it into kind of what your top tier leadership is looking at on a regular basis. And then across the organization, as you're doing quarterly business reviews or whatever that rhythm of the business is for you, making sure that that's woven in terms of how people are looking at it on a regular basis. And so I think by infusing it into these different areas and different touch points, um, it's easier to kind of get it, show it as a strategic imperative than it is if you're kind of setting it aside as like a nice to have over off in the margins of your business.
Mm. Infused, woven, ingrained into the fabric. I think it's a
Yeah.
really good point, because I've seen it done before where there's a team that's really pushing this, and it just comes in email form and message form, and everyone's like, it's another one of those events, or whatever it is. It needs to be within every single team, within daily conversations. How do you infuse it? So that's a really good idea. Um, in terms of a success story, which is pretty similar to that actually, we were looking to do it as part of an old organization, and we were taking it really seriously, which was great. And we got everyone together, kind of our team, um, decent in terms of diversity, and we just sat down and shared experiences. Shared
Mhm.
experiences of when people have been subject to discrimination. And at first, it was slow. People weren't always comfortable to speak, but we made clear it was a safe space, and eventually people started to open up. And it was amazing because everyone's eyes opened, and they were like, "Wow, I had no idea this sort of thing happened." And it was typically people from well, let's say, for example, it wasn't someone like me, kind of white, straight male,
Mhm.
because I've been fortunate enough to not be subject to too much discrimination in my life. But it was people from different minorities and things. They were the ones who were opening up and sharing their experiences, which whether it be sexism or racism or whatever it might be. And some of the stories were horrible, and I think
Mhm.
it helped everyone's eyes really open up and think, "Wow, I speak to you every day, and we get on really well, and I can't believe you're subject to these sorts of things." And it helped create a bond, and everyone kind of was then looking out for each other. And
Yeah.
whatever goes on outside these four walls, we will do our best to affect. But in these four walls, and whenever we're out with them, we will do everything we can to protect each other. So it created a real bond actually, and it helped open everyone's eyes. And something I'm quite curious about is, why aren't there more people of my demographic talking about this and focusing on it? Because again, we did something similar in the business where I reckon it was majority 65% of people were my demographic. And we had a
Mhm.
DEI champions panel, and everyone was outside of that demographic apart from me. In an organization of 100 people, we had about maybe 15 people on this DEI champions panel. And I asked the question, I was like, why am I the only white guy here? I was like, our organization is not a true representation of our demographic as a business. And
Mhm.
the questions were, do we not care about it as a demographic? Or are we ashamed or nervous to talk about it? Um,
Mhm.
or do we just not appreciate it because we haven't been subject to it? And there were three good questions. And then we started to kind of ask these questions to my demographic. And a lot of it was embarrassment. Some people didn't quite understand. It was different for every single person. But I'd love to see
Mhm.
more of it because, to be in a
Yeah.
privileged position, you can't just be ignorant. You need to drive the change. And if that is the majority demographic, which I think it will be for some time, we need to be super conscious of it.
Yeah.
So doing like a LinkedIn search, putting in the word diversity, you won't see many white males with that title in their name, and
Yeah.
it's a shame.
Yeah. It's interesting though too, because I think there is a lot of conversation happening, that there actually needs to be more diversity that of people who are leading this work, and kind of really bringing in the most marginalized. But at the same time, there does need to be a lot more support from kind of the group that would be acting as allies for whatever kind of demographic you could be an ally from. I'm a firm believer that everyone can be an ally for someone, within a historically underrepresented or historically marginalized group. And I actually created a program at one of my former companies that was really kind of in an effort to bring more men into the conversation about um, gender inclusion. And we had some very powerful discussions. It was all white, straight white men and VP and above level roles, and I think most of it was they didn't understand the experiences that women and non-binary colleagues were having on a regular basis. And it's kind of like there's a great piece that I think kind of gets to the essence of this work in terms of bringing allies in, and it's this concept of like a fish in a water. Fish doesn't really understand that it's swimming around in water, similar to how so many of these organizations were set up by straight white men, and so the culture is for straight white men, and they don't necessarily see that culture, right?
Mm.
They're like fish in water. So when you take a step back and you start to understand the perspectives of other people that are experiencing the culture in a much different way because it wasn't built to support them, you start to see the water, you see kind of the culture, and you can understand it a little bit better. And so I absolutely agree. I do think that a lot more people need to kind of be willing to step into this conversation and to have the dialogue. Um, and it's incredibly powerful to see when that does happen and when companies are standing up these programs and creating some safe spaces for individuals that probably aren't comfortable about having these different conversations. Um, they get to ask the questions that they want to ask, but they don't want to ask the question on stage in front of hundreds and hundreds of people. But they do want to understand. And so I think the more that companies can kind of create some of those opportunities, whether it's through coaching, or whether it's through just kind of individual experiences and opportunities within each company, it's very important to open that dialogue. um, but doing so, making sure that you have the right support structure in place and some of the resources available that can help kind of move beyond, because it takes time. The program I created was a 6-month program. It was not kind of a one and done conversation. And so really creating that support system, with resources and information is powerful.
A really good analogy again there with the fish in water, and that's really really good. And yeah, I admire the work that you do, and I think it's super, super important. And as you say, that opening people's eyes. People do want to learn, but it's just starting the conversation and having somebody there to really drive it, and somebody with passion who has empathy and can, talk around and not assume that somebody doesn't care. It's just education. So now, very, I admire the work that you're doing and what fellow professionals are doing around this space. It is getting better, but I think we've got some time to go, which I think is a nice question to conclude with. Um, in 10 years' time, for example, how do you think, maybe not just necessarily the energy storage world, but how do you think we'll look in 10 years from a DEI perspective?
Ooh, that's such a good question. Um, Gosh, I hope that there's a more understanding for the importance of this work, and I hope that it's more kind of woven into the expectations of a business. And I think I'm seeing kind of glimmers of that. Um, I would love to see companies just adequately represent the communities that they serve, where they live, um, their customers, uh, and I would love to see kind of that people understand that we are more similar than we are different, and to really lean into the empathy side of this work, and create businesses where, regardless of where you come from, you can thrive. And I think we've seen so much progress in that. I mean, just think of virtual, even hybrid work, right? Or kind of remote work. That was never a thing not too long ago, and we've seen it open up, and that creates so much opportunity for people who are either need that remote option, for disability reasons. They need that remote option because they're a single mom. There's so many things, and that's one example where we can support uh, so many more people coming into to our organizations. And so I think just continuing to kind of see that momentum and build upon it is going to be, I hope, I have hope, and I like the term contagious optimism, and so I'm contagiously optimistic that we'll get there in the next 10 years. We'll see, vastly more inclusive organizations than we have today, because we're seeing vastly more inclusive organizations than we saw 10 years ago.
Yeah, fingers crossed. I mean, the rate of improvement has been amazing to see over the past 5 or 10 years. So, hopefully that just accelerates as, more and more people are getting into it, which are sharing stories. And I think the more that we can surround ourselves with different people, the quicker this is going to happen and the more perspective you're going to have on life
Yeah,
and on your existence. And it is so healthy, so,
yeah,
so healthy not to be, as you say, a fish in water who doesn't really understand it. You start to gain more
exactly.
perspective. So, um, thank you so much, Charlotte, for today. I've really enjoyed having you on and talking about this, something I'm very passionate about. And good luck with your journey at Group14.
Thank you.
And yeah, thank you again for coming on.
Oh, thanks so much for inviting me. This was great. Appreciate it.
No problem. Thank you again. Cheers, Charlotte.
All right.
Bye.
Bye.